most of the time is spent in the cash crop world. So it's nice to be able to spend more in the livestock and get a bit of feedback myself and learn a bit more in terms of what livestock corn growers are looking for, information or agronomy wise, that sort of thing. But with that, in terms of sustainable corn production, I really wanted to focus on nitrogen management. There's been a lot of focus on nitrogen right now in terms of trying to reduce emissions and that sort of thing. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about trying to sharpen nitrogen management skills. So in terms of tools out there, in terms of what you can do to manage nitrogen, if your question is one of the big things about managing nitrogen is putting the right rate of nitrogen on. And of all the things you can do to reduce emissions, the right rate is probably has the biggest impact on reducing emissions. So in terms of tools that are out there, if you're just kind of looking for, what's a general optimum rate for a given field scenario, in most cases, we would point to the corn nitrogen calculator. So if you haven't seen it before, this is just a screenshot of the spreadsheet version, which is available at gocorn.net. Essentially, you open this spreadsheet up and it asks for some of your agronomic information. So what kind of soil type are you on? What's your yield expectation, heat units, previous crop? And then it'll adjust. Basically, it's kind of what's an average optimum rate for your given agronomic backgrounds on the farm that you're looking at. You also have the opportunity to enter the economics. So what your price of corn is, what kind of fertilizer you're using, what the price of fertilizer is. And then it will give an optimum rate, again, from a big database of Ontario trials that have been done over the past several decades, what an optimum rate would be based on all of that information adjusted for economics. There's also room to enter manure credits, which we've also had some tools to help calculate as well. So AgriSuite would be the main tool, but I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But yeah, in terms of kind of an average starting rate, if you're trying to compare what am I doing now compared to what's maybe suggested, gives you an idea of how those two might compare in that system. One more tool you might hear about in terms of trying to manage nitrogen is what we call the pre-side dress nitrate test, or PSNT. It's a little bit different from the Andy calculator. Instead of looking at average responses, this is actually going out to the field just before side dress time. And we know when corn's maybe not quite knee-high stage, taking a 12-inch soil probe out of the field and getting a ppm value for what the nitrate level is in that field. So you can see in the recommendations, the left-hand side of that table gives the ppm values that you might get back from the lab, somewhere in that range. And then for a given yield expectation, you can see the columns going across the top of that table, gives you a nitrogen recommendation based on how much is there and what your expected typical yield would be for that field. So a little bit different, just going off of nitrogen supply. Now, that said, it can be a bit more challenging to use this tool. It can fluctuate based on temperature, but I think, especially if you're in a livestock scenario, if you've got manure in the system from spring or you've got other fertilizer down, the one challenge of the tool used as is it's really only calibrated for background natural soil mineralization. So it's maybe not the best fit if there's manure and stuff in the system. That said, I know there are some that use it as a relative tool. So they'll still go out and test to get a relative number to compare fields or maybe compare year to year, that sort of thing. You maybe can't use the recommendation in that scenario, but can still give you an idea of nitrogen supply on a relative basis. So the other tools you might be looking at as well are legume and manure credits. So if you've got alfalfa in the rotation, you're plowing that down and you want to know what the credit is, there's credits for that as well. I think the bigger thing that maybe applies more is manure credits too. So there's a screenshot there of the AgriSuite website. If you go into AgriSuite, there's lots of options to go and try to estimate what your manure credits might be based on your system. So again, I'll get into that a little bit more later on, but that's where you would go to find the manure credit website. So that's kind of what we have right now for nitrogen adjustment tools. There's been some recent work in terms of, where could we move directions to improve the accuracy of these tools. And I think anytime I do a nitrogen talk, this is probably one of my favorite slides to show. So these are nitrogen rate response curves. So you can see on the vertical axis, there's grain corn yield. And you can see on the horizontal axis across the bottom is nitrogen rates. So in general, you can see that as you apply nitrogen, those curves start to go up because we get yield response to those nitrogen applications. The further you go, they start to eventually slow down. You get less and less yield as you apply N. And eventually you hit a spot where they plateau. So you can keep on applying nitrogen fertilizer, but you're not going to get any more yield response out of that nitrogen that crop has got what it needs to maximize yields. So you can see that there are 6 curves in this graph, and each of those curves represents an end response curve on the exact same research plot at the Elora research station. So, the interesting thing here is that really the only thing that we're comparing is different growing seasons. We can't say it's a soil or a field thing because that always stays constant. We're really comparing end response in different years. And really what this site shows is that, first of all, we tend at this location have pretty minimal supply in background soil nitrogen. And the reason we say that is those zero N yields tend to be fairly stable. There's a little bit of change year to year, but they're relatively stable. We also say there's minimal N loss. So in season, we don't tend to see a lot of nitrogen loss at this farm, which has to go into things as well. And the reason I say that is in this trial, Bill Dean, who did the work, he compared pre-plant applications to side dress applications in crop and rarely ever saw a difference in yields or difference in efficiency for those applications, which would suggest that where this trial was done, the N losses was really not a big issue. But the really interesting thing is that, year to year, rainfall was really a big driver of these. You can see the little diamonds on those curves. Those all represent what the optimum rates would be for each of those curves. There's different diamonds because they represent different price scenarios. We can kind of see in general where those diamonds fall in those curves. But of course, in a low yielding year, like that yellow line, which is the lowest in 2012, which is a droughty year at Elora, corn yields in that trial were only a little over 100 bushels an acre. In this data set, the highest yielding year yields were well over 200 bushels an acre. So I think we're kind of more in the 220 bushel an acre range. And then they fell anywhere in between those years. But the interesting thing is when Bill and his grad student, Caleb Niemeyer, looked at this data, it was kind of that rainfall between mid-June and mid-July was really driving yields. And that rainfall was really, or the demand for yields at this field was really driving optimum nitrogen rates. So low yielding year, not a lot of demand for nitrogen, optimum N rates are low. High yielding year, demand for nitrogen was high, and optimal N rates were also high in those years. So I think moving forwards, one thing that we don't have right now, but I think would maybe be the next direction in terms of nitrogen recommendations would be trying to incorporate some kind of weather adjustment into recommendations. Something we don't have right now, but based on some of this work, is maybe a future direction I think would be interesting to again, fine-tune nitrogen recommendations a little bit more. So, next question, and there's been a lot of this interest right now, especially when we're talking about nitrogen rates, and especially when price of nitrogen fertilizer is really high, is, what can you do on farm to try to help confirm what your optimum N rate is on farm? I think there's a couple methods that are relatively easy. Now, again, we're talking grain corn that you can do to try to estimate what an optimal N rate is. Anytime we do research plots, we put 5 different N rates out. So you can see the little sets of dots on this graph. We get yields for all of those different N rates. We make this response curve, and then we can put economics on that curve and determine what the optimum N rate is. Usually it's a little bit before those yields plateau. That's typically what the optimum N rate is. So this is real data. This was real on-farm trials that we had done in the past. You can see with no nitrogen applied, yields were a little under 150 bushels an acre. The maximum yields when we maxed things out with nitrogen was about 200 bushels an acre. So that 55 bushels is what we were trying to gain with nitrogen fertilizer. And the optimum rate of nitrogen in this field was about 120 pounds an acre. You can see that green line. That was the optimum based on the prices of corn and prices of fertilizer. Of course, it's a lot of work, and you have to have some statistical tools to do this. So it's really not very practical to do from an on-farm perspective. There's a couple tools that we can use to try to look at optimum N rates on farm and without having to do all that work. One is what we call the N rate evaluator tool. So this, we put down a 0 N strip, so no fertilizer applied in that strip. And then right beside it, we put an N rich strip. So in that case, a nitrogen rate that we think would be non-limiting for yield. So might be 200, 220 pounds of N, that kind of thing. The other thing we do is the grower rate test. So one thing you could do is just to put your normal grower rate out and do a strip beside it that's 30 pounds less and a strip beside it that's 30 pounds more, and then try to see what if you get differences in yield or not. So just a general example, the delta yield, that's that first one I did. And I guess this is the question. I don't know if I can actually see the chats or not, but if you had to guess, if you put no nitrogen on a field, now again, with manure, it's maybe a little bit different if you've had long-term manure, but if you had to guess what yields would be with no nitrogen, what would your estimates be? So in our trials that we've averaged, typically if you put no nitrogen on that field, you'd maybe get 55, somewhere maybe between 50 and 60% of the yields you get if you maximize yields with nitrogen fertilizer. So that gives an idea of the yield that we're trying to go after. So again, this is an example of that same curve. We would look at our yields with no nitrogen, somewhere maybe around 140, where we maxed out yields at about 200 bushels an acre. That kind of 50 to 60 bushels is what we're trying to capture with nitrogen fertilizer. And using this tool, those are the two yields we're trying to look at. A zero N yield, which in this field was 140, maybe an N rich, which was around 200, is one example of how you might use this. This is a livestock farmer in Oxford County. Normally, he applies 160 pounds of N on his corn, but he was curious if this rate was correct. He didn't want to do 5 rates like we do in research, so he did a 0 N strip and an N rich strip to try to find out what his optimum was. Where he applied no nitrogen, his yields were 126 and 123 bushels an acre. Where he applied a non-limiting rate, his yields were around 240 bushels an acre. So on average, he was getting about 110 bushel an acre yield response to nitrogen. When you plug those into that N-rate evaluator tool, so the difference between the 0 N and the N-rich strips, and then also add economics in for corn and nitrogen fertilizer prices, it would suggest his optimum rate was around 155, 160. So in this case here, he was actually quite close in this year in that field to what his optimum N rate actually is. So again, like I showed before, it can vary year to year. So he's going to continue on doing this a couple of years. But he was pretty interested to see that his optimum rate was pretty close to what he had traditionally been doing. The 30-pound test, again, you might do your normal rate and then do a strip beside it. On either side, 30 pounds less and 30 pounds more than what you normally do. It won't give you the optimum rate, but at least give you an idea of how you, if you would respond to more fertilizer, or if you could pull back rates if you don't see any yield loss for pulling rates back a little bit. Again, this is a real on-farm data that was done. So Whalen Farms, Quinte region, he normally applies 170 pounds to his corn. He's had significant yield increases in the past 10 to 15 years, and he'd like to know if his N rate is still sufficient, but he doesn't want to do a 0 nitrogen strip like in the example before. So in this case here, he did the 30-pound test. So his normal grower rate he does is 170 pounds of N. His yield under that was 245 bushels an acre. He did the test where he did 30 pounds less to see if he's going to lose yield if he pulls N rates back. In this case, he did. He used 230 bushels, so he lost 15 bushels by pulling 30 pounds back. So certainly in that field in 2022, he did not want to pull N rates back from what his current rate is. Of course, his question, should I be putting more N out there to am I losing yield with these high yields I'm getting now that I didn't have before? In this case here, when he threw another 30 pounds on, he was 240 bushels. So it's a little bit lower. I don't think the additional nitrogen actually reduced yields. I think it was just a field variability thing. But clearly, he didn't get a response to the extra N. So again, in this case here, he was pretty happy to see that his rate that he's currently putting on seems to be pretty close to where he probably should be. So again, gave him some confidence around that. Despite his higher yields he has nowadays, he still seems to be in the ballpark for his optimum N rate, at least in that test for that field last year. Again, in terms of trying to look at things, one thing that we played around with this past growing season, being so dry, we really weren't really concerned about N losses like we might be in some years. So we want to do some end of season nitrate. So we went into some cornfields, we did some sampling, try to get an idea of at the end of the year, once corn is done taking up nitrogen because it's matured, how much nitrogen is typically left over in kind of an average grower's field. So I say we use actually Jake Monroe and Colin Elgie, so our soil management and soil fertility specialists who went out and pulled these fields. These were a dozen samples they had pulled kind of early October. And on average, there was still about 60 pounds of N left in a lot of these fields. The lowest had about 20 pounds of N left. So that grower is pretty close maybe to where he should have been. But the worst ones were, one field that's number 11 was a little under 100 pounds. And then number 12 was a little over 100 pounds. So certainly still lots of N in some of those fields. And when we dug a bit deeper on some of those fields, particularly field number 12, where there was well over 100 pounds of N left, in this scenario, the grower he had 200 bushel an acre corn. He was normally applying 160 pounds of N, but he always had red clover the year before or after his wheat. Reasonable stands and not perfect, so he was always hesitant to try to credit that red clover. But clearly in this case, you can see he still had piles of N left. So if he's hesitant giving a full credit, maybe he could still has room to pull things back without giving up on yield. So maybe not a tool that works every year, but something we've tried playing around with this year to see if it's one more thing that could guide N rates. Just to kind of wrap things up again, I talked about AgriSuite before. So this is the tool you can go to and get an idea of manure credits. There's textbook values for manure based on samples that have been submitted to labs, but you can also enter your own. And ideally, I think the best thing would be to sample your own manure for manure fertility values, as well as pH and carbon and nitrogen ratios, which can impact management of those manures as well. Of course, trying to manage manure, there's two different types that we're trying to manage in crops: organic, nitrogen, and ammonium. Organic takes a bit of time to break down. Ammonium is available right away, just like nitrogen fertilizer would be. If you're in a manure with a high carbon and nitrogen ratio, so like a lot of bedding, a lot of straw, that manure takes some time to break down, like the solid cattle graph on the right. In terms of efficiency of those manures, fall or summer applications tend to get more because by the time it breaks down over the growing or over the winter time, it's kind of available for the corn crop the next year. Whereas you compare that with liquid hog manure, which is mostly ammonium, like nitrogen fertilizer, and readily available because there's not a lot of carbon there. Fall and summer applications efficiency tends to be low because you can lose a lot of that. But if you make those applications in springtime when it's available for the crop, tends to be a lot better. So I won't go into details, but you can do a lot of things like timing of manure applications, changing your manure amounts, and when you apply those manures. And again, this table is pretty busy, but it'll give you a lot of ideas of how incorporation, timing of application, all those things will impact how much nitrogen availability and your other nutrients as well. So a decent tool if you want to get a handle on those you haven't used before, will at least give you some ballpark ideas for what credits might be for nitrogen you're using in your manure. And I will leave it at that.